Well, hello, my friends. This is Pastor Chris Quimby of Harmony Bible Church in South Thomaston, Maine, and I'm here for the Midweek online Bible study, something that we've been doing for a couple months now. And what we have been doing is going through the prayers of the Bible and asking ourselves certain questions about them. I'm taking a departure from that this week because the way my sermon scheduling worked out, we have what could be one remaining week in this series that we've been doing called A Cloud of Witnesses. We've been doing this series for months. We have roughly one more week to do it, but if I'm going to do my Advent Christmas series at the time I need to start it in order to finish it by Christmas, then I don't have that Sunday to preach. I did have a plan to where we're at the end of chapter 11 in Hebrews of lumping together Rahab, the faith of Rahab, with all of the other that are listed at the end of that chapter. Jephthah, Samson, Gideon, and others. And I had looked to call that sermon Honorable Mentions. Instead, we'll do that Honorable Mentions sermon today, but without Rahab, because I was encouraged, which most of you would have heard by now, the sermon on Rahab. I was encouraged to give Rahab her own week, and admitting that that was a bit of an oversight on my part, I have decided to give Rahab her own week. So for this week, whereas normally we would go through the prayers of the Bible, we'll just use this to finish off that series in Hebrews, A Cloud of Witnesses. So if you're following along with me, and I recommend that you do, we are in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. This is going to be different than I usually construct my sermons in a certain way, and I'm not limiting myself to that. This is going to be more of a Bible study, and I'm always tempted to say a rather quick one, but that's never true. So it'll be as long as it is. Hebrews 11, the passage that we're going to be in starts at verse 32, and it goes through the end of the chapter, verse 32 through to and including verse 40 of Hebrews 11. For a backdrop, I will say this. So I usually start my sermons out with some type of an illustration to build connection. And so I will do that. And that is an illustration that's probably lost on most of the people that listen to my sermons, because we've been over this in church before, the fact that I'm a sports fan, specifically a professional sports fan, specifically a professional basketball fan, specifically a Celtics fan. But one thing regarding, particularly before COVID hit and really hurt all sports leagues, the condition of the league was such that there was a lot of money in the National Basketball Association, and players, some of the best players were making upwards of $30 million per year. Yeah, you heard that right. And I've been a NBA fan for all of my adult life, plus a few years. And that wasn't the case just when I started watching the league. And there's a division in understanding between the players of old, of the 60s and 70s and 80s, and these players now in the 21st century. A conversation had recently between two of them left one of the younger players from this generation barely believing that the older guys that actually only played, I think, 20 or 30 years ago, these younger players couldn't believe that those guys used to have to fly commercial flights, because now the teams have private jets, and that's just one of the differences. But players back then, I remember Larry Bird was one of my favorite players. I remember when he began making, I think, $1 million, and that was a big deal. I think he was one of the first players to make $1 million a year. Don't quote me on that, but I'm referencing a news article that I vaguely remember from decades ago. But $1 million was like a big deal to make in a year, and so to graduate to the place where guys are making $30 million plus, some of the better ones, That's quite a change. And one thing that is sometimes encouraged for these younger players of this generation is to remember that what they have now, this league that they inherited, is from the hard work of the players of decades ago, of commissioners and other administrative personnel within the league who've managed it in certain ways, who've stewarded their responsibilities to take what they received or to even be creative in what they developed, to craft a certain product and to hand that on, hopefully, in a way where it's in a better condition than it was when they received it. So all of these players of this generation have inherited that. They didn't have to invent the NBA. They didn't have to market it over the course of decades to get to the point where it's ingrained in culture and is so popular around the world that there would be this much money flowing into it. They are encouraged to recall all of those players before who would be, in an analogous sense, like these Old Testament saints that we've been studying. This cloud of witnesses, if I can say so without being irreverent, all of those that came before, that they can draw encouragement, inspiration, that they can get lessons from. And we don't want to relax this analogy too far, but it's just a point to say that as we, as believers who live now in the 21st century, look back upon our lives, we can look back to the lives of other real people in history who can inspire us by the way in which they exercise their faith, and through whose lives we can be inspired to see that the same God that we pray to and serve is faithful as their God was faithful. As a review, we've talked about Abel, Noah, talked about Abraham, Sarah, a few stories of Abraham, Isaac, his son Isaac, Abraham's son Isaac, the miracle baby, as it were, Jacob, Joseph kids, Ephraim and Manasseh, and bunches of stories of Moses, both the faithfulness, the faith of the parents of Moses, the faith of Moses that would have him leave the comforts and the expectation of sin and all of the power that growing up in that kingdom would afford him, and turning his back on that to suffer with God's people. So we get up to that, and then last Sunday, I'm recording this on Saturday, but I post it usually on Tuesday. A couple days ago, those who attend Harmony Bible Church would have heard the sermon on Rahab, who is the last person listed before the author of Hebrews lists a bunch in a row. So we'll read those verses from Hebrews, and let's take a little bit of time to explore them and then land the plane in this book, in this series, excuse me. So Hebrews, as I said, chapter 11, verses 32 through the end of the chapter, which is verse 40. God's word says, "And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets." I'll stop here to say I get it. More attention was paid to other saints, some of whom were the ones that we already mentioned in listing them. And basically there's a honorable mentions, a bunch of just a listing of names whose stories we can go back to the Old Testament and learn of, but the author here is saying, well, what more shall I say? And then lists those. And I'll tell you, if you want to, for homework, go back and learn the stories, read the stories of some of these people, you will find that it will confuse you as to why some of them made it into a chapter in the Bible which makes much of them as being respectable in matters of faith. But it's good to wrestle with things in Scripture. And you will find that although some of these men had chapters in their life which fell far short of respectability, there were episodes in their life in which they exercised faith in God for certain events, and God was faithful to see them through, and God makes much of them, putting them here in what Christians normally call the hall of faith. And that should be, rather than as much of a confusion for us about why they're there, let's treat that as an encouragement to us who, if we're honest with ourselves, and if our lives were written down without being abridged or edited in any way for the world to see, might find that there are many episodes of our own life, even just our inner world, which might make us a bit embarrassed for generations in the future to consume. Continuing in verse 33, speaking of these and all the rest that we... he's speaking of these listed, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. Okay, we're not going to get super deep into this, but we want to go back, just contextualize what was said here. He lists names. He lists names of those: Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. So that's a large group of people. And then itemizes some of the things that the experiences of these people's lives were challenges that they went through. And we read that list, and you're, of course, welcome to go back and read those yourself. But they're talking about conflicts and difficulties that people went through, and through faith, through an exercise of active faith, as we've talked about in this series, they faced those situations. Some of these things are referred to elsewhere in Scripture, like certainly the names. You can go back to each of these names in the Old Testament and study what their lives on earth were like. Vaguely mentioning women receiving back their dead by resurrection. There are stories in the Old Testament where you can go back to and see that. And some of these are based on Christian tradition. Like, for example, says they were stoned, they were sawn in two. Tradition holds it that Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, met his final end in being sawn in two. What a horrible way to go. It's a lot worse than dying in your sleep. So that puts the end on the discussion of all of those that this author had brought up within this 11th chapter of Hebrews as those who exercised active faith, like we talked about. Not a funny feeling, but they leaned on God in a very obvious and evident way to trust in Him. Either they lived a life close to God, they lived a life in obedience to God, either they lived a life of dependence on God, or they lived with confidence in the unseen. You can see evidences of at least one of those in each of the narratives of each of these people's lives. And at the end, these last two verses that we just read, and all these, though commended through their faith, didn't receive what was promised. Okay, so what does that mean? These Old Testament saints didn't have what we have right now, this contemporary description of what the fulfillment of the promise is. The ultimate fulfillment of the the promise of God is that He would send the Messiah, and that the Messiah, through His ministry, would grant us access to the promised land. Now, not just the promised land that was promised to Abraham and that was a pursuit through the patriarchs, through Joseph, through Moses, this promised land of Canaan that we see, we see Joshua, as we preached on recently, and then Rahab, who was part of this land of this city of Jericho, whose walls came down under the power of God in this land of Canaan, that Joshua was then leading the Israelite nation to find and to capture and to make their own. Now we're talking about not just a physical promised land, but the promised land, the new heavens and the new earth, wherein righteousness dwells. It's referenced also back in Hebrews. We preached a sermon on this as well. Hebrews 11 verses 13 through 16, where to that point in listing those Enoch, Abel, Abraham, Noah, verse 13 says, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they're seeking a homeland. If they'd been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country." Okay, they're strangers and pilgrims here on earth, like you are. They desire a better country. And they're not talking about a different place that you'd have to slap a sticker on a passport to get to. That is, he clarifies, a heavenly one. "Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared for them a city." So this is talking about that promised land that they were ultimately in expectation of, and that we have more information on, this Messiah that will provide this for us, that we, those of us in this age, have advantage to because of this revelation from God. And that is what, if you've watched the show, I'm sure you probably watched a show or a movie. This is a neat cinematic device where at the beginning, they'll show you the end of the story. But it'll be shrouded in mystery because you wonder automatically, well, how did things arrive at this point for this person who we're seeing in this movie or this show? And then they'll spend the rest of whether it's a movie or a show or a miniseries, going way back to the beginning and allowing you to get up to that point where you finally find out how things arrived there with that narrative taken out of context right at the beginning of your viewing. That's a bit how we've handled Hebrews 11 here, where the first teaching that we did in this series was on Hebrews 12. Okay, so we started a series in Hebrews 11 by going through 2 verses in Hebrews chapter 12. So after marching all the way through there, we're back there now. So what is the message of Hebrews 12 verses 1 and 2, which say, "Therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses," all these people, Enoch, Abel, Abraham, Sarah, Joshua, Joseph, Isaac, Moses, Rahab, all of them. So since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, basically saying, so since we have access to details of the lives of those that came before us, don't think of it as witnesses like they're looking on us. Think of it as they're witnesses because they witnessed the faithfulness of God, and we can draw back from their experiences. He says, let us also lay aside, let you listening to this, if you're a believer, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. Stop right there real quick. So all of this stuff is connected. All of these lives that were lived in the past are useful to us so that we might understand the importance of running smartly, of casting aside anything, just like as if you were in a regular race. You wouldn't want to wear moon boots and carry a backpack with an anvil on either arm, if you could even hold such a thing. You want to be lean, okay? You want to not have any more weight on you than you need to. As we are running a race, we are accountable before God to exercise active faith, without which it is impossible to please God. So believers, it is incumbent upon us to, like them, exercise faith in God, which pleases God. But ultimately, while we can draw inspiration from them, ultimately we draw our ultimate inspiration from Jesus. Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Jesus, who exercised faith in his Father actively by doing what he came here to do, regardless of the difficulty. Why? Because he had that hope as well. For the joy that was set before him, he counted the cost. Basically, he suffered the cross because it was a means by which he could complete his ministry towards God and allow us to have this access to the promised land that we have. It says, it continues on saying, the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. He put it all behind him, all that other stuff, and he focused on what he should focus on. Who for the joy, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So it's really good. Sometimes it's encouraging for us when we're beaten down and we feel weak and our faith may be small, to have other people come up to us and give us more of a big picture. Are you like me, that sometimes when you get frustrated and weak, you tend to get tunnel vision and focus on just the things in your life that are difficult for you or that seem to be holding you back, the things that seem to be in opposition to you? But what a great friend it is who can give us, without being pithy about it, but can give us a bigger perspective on reality, particularly that we're all, in a lot of good hymns, will point us to this reality, that a recognition that, yeah, there are toils and snares and difficulties that we now abide, but ultimately this is where we're heading. For the joy that was set before us, let us, like all of the Old Testament saints, like Christ, the founder and perfecter of our faith, get a long view and recognize that this stuff isn't in vain, that God has prepared a place for us. And while we don't want to be emotionally distant and uninvolved from this world that we have here, we need to recognize, like it says back in Hebrews 11:13 through 16, that we are strangers and pilgrims here, and God is preparing for us a better country, whose maker and builder is God. He's the best contractor out there. So, as we end this series, let's be thankful that God has worked through these people in the past, that God has, through faithful men, recorded these things so we can be reminded of them. And let us lay aside every weight and the sin which easily holds us back, and recognize what we're here for, and be serious about exercising real faith before God. Again, important, I repeat this a lot because it's important, without which you cannot please God. And you might say, well, but I don't do all these sins here, and I do this good, so I go to church, 45 to 50 times a week. Well, no, stop that. Stop it with that. Some of that stuff, sometimes some matters of obedience are ways through which we can exercise faith. But be honest with your heart. Do you exercise active faith in God in a way that affects it's active, right? It affects your behavior. It affects your thinking. Things are different because you believe in God than they would be if you didn't. Your life looks different because you believe in God than it would if you did not. Believer, let's take that seriously because God does, okay? And I want to thank you for all the time that you've spent with me as we've journeyed through Hebrews 11. I've really enjoyed this. It's been nice to use the New Testament to get back into the Old Testament. And it's always healthy for us to see how these things connect together and that they're not two disparate parts and books that were just bound together physically, but they're bound together within God's entire redemptive plan. So don't be afraid to get excited about the fact that God has given you a purpose, that He's redeemed you from darkness into light, that you are among a great company of those of varying degrees of imperfection who God still chose to interrupt the lives of and show Himself faithful. Allow Him to do that in your life so that your life might be that kind of an encouragement to existing believers around you, and who knows, even to future generations of those who have not even yet been born. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to going through a 5-week series coming up here until Christmas, in which we discover, we explore a little bit more the names of God from Isaiah. I think it's 9:6. Wonderful, everlasting, wonderful Counselor, mighty God, so on and so forth. And that should be a good series. And I think we're all ready to have some of the normalcy, some of the what we look forward to. Normally the traditions of Christmas kind of like bother me. I'm looking forward to them this year because I'm excited to have some stuff that's somewhat normal and traditional, because so much of this year has been abnormal. So anyway, believers, thank you for spending your time with me. May God richly bless you as you look to serve Him.